Let's now move to another biggie here, and this is Basel II International Convergence of Capital Measurement and Capital Standard. It's a part of the Operational and Integrated Risk Management for the FRM Part 2 exam. Now, in this topic, we are going to get a review of Basel II. We should understand basic framework of Basel II and how it differs from original accord. We should know three pillar and three tier definition, understand the conceptual difference between standardized internal rate basing approaches. This topic provides a big picture approach to the assigned material, and we are not required to memorize thing. So I'll talk about the trickier things here directly. So Basel II is aimed at large international banks, and committee the Basel committee has established a three opinion for calculating the capital risk requirement, and the three opinions are standardized approach. This approach is essentially the same as the original Basel, but the risk weighting is based on each borrower on its provided external credit rating sources such as S&P and corporation. So that's the standardized approach. Now we have three approaches, and the other is internal rating based approach. The internal risk weighting approach is a hybrid of internal and external. The bank can use internal estimate of default probabilities, but should use external sources for other models such as loss given default. Regulators often provide the later information. So loss given default will be provided by the regulators, and they can use their internal source for default of probability. Then finally it's internal rating based, which is advanced. So bank generate everything. So bank generates loss given default as well as the probability of default. Now there are three pillars of Basel II Accord. Basel II recognizes three pillars of sound bank management that deal with capital requirement, supervisory review by regulators, and market discipline based on disclosure. The first pillar is highly quantitative assessment of capital requirement. Although the main focus of the pillar is credit risk, operation risk is also an important part of determining capital adequacy. Pillar 2 envisions a formal role for regulators in an effort to identify and stem potential problem. The regulator will provide a credible check for the inputs used in the Basel model and detect risks that are not in Pillar 1. Additionally, frequent monitoring allows for intervention earlier rather than later if a corrective measure is needed. Also, the Pillar 2 regulators can set the requirement higher than 8% of Basel 1. Pillar 3 focuses on capital market external monitoring of the bank. The institution must be required to disclose to quantify for regulatory capital treatment. This disclosure also provided the financial committee information on the bank's risk exposure and capital adequacy. If you remember, you can see all those stress tests that happens and a lot of documentation on that, and the bank clearly disclose the parameters of those stress tests. You can just Google around and you can check out those. Then we have capital requirement and how to calculate them. So while the actual calculation for computing the capital requirement uh, are uh, are quite involved, and we'll look at the qualitative aspect here. So banks risk based capital calculation, it's total capital divided by the total risk weight assets. On the Basel II, the risk weighting were based for credit risk only. So basic risk based capital calculation is total capital divided by total risk weighted assets. So that's the basic capital requirement. Now under Basel II, assets are risk weighted for credit risk, market risk, and operational risk. The revised ratio is known as capital ratio or capital adequacy ratio. As mentioned, the total risk weighted assets are broken down into credit risk, market risk, and operation risk. According to Basel II, bank's capital ratio must exceed 8%. This mandate 8% capital requirement is used to determine capital charge for a given risk. So the whole thing must be greater than 8%. For example, the capital risk for credit risk is computed as 8% of risk weighted asset for credit risk. In order to compute total risk weighted assets, we have to start with risk weighted asset for credit risk. The calculation for risk weighted asset for credit risk is simply the sum of credit risky asset multiplied by corresponding risk weights. Now we understand that we are moving into the denominator part here. So when we add the capital charges for market and operational risk, method for calculating capital charges for operation and market risk will be something that we need to look at, but that's how we'll add the capital charges to find out total risk-weighted assets. Since we need to determine the risk-weighted asset for market and operationally, we need to divide the capital charge amount by 8%, or alternative multiply by 12.5%. In other words, if you already know the capital charge for market and operational risk, we know that it must be equal to at least 8% of the risk-weighted asset for a given risk. Now let's take an example to understand this. Suppose the sum of risk-weighted asset for credit risk is 1500. So total weight upon total risk-weighted assets, and we know that the risk-weighted assets are 1500, and also the market risk capital charge or the requirement is $30, and the operational risk capital charge is $50. Now we can calculate the total risk asset as 1500 plus both the risk capital charges into 12.5, because we know that this 12.5 would be 8%. So when we do that, we get 2500, and this should be, and we now need to find out 8% of this, which should be calculated. So the 8% should be 200 in capital. So we'll look more about this in the later coming part. So now let's look at the standardized approach. The standardized approach under Basel II assign a risk weight to each asset based on its credit risk, that is probability of default. An asset's assigned risk weight can range from 0 high quality sovereign debt to 100% for corporate debt based on credit rating. Since 8% is capital requirement, this serves as the benchmark for calculating the capital contribution for each asset. Let's look at a simple example here. Suppose a bank has 100 million of loan portfolio split equally between a debt that is UK debt, which is AAA rated, and corporate debt. Now we have to calculate capital requirement for bank. Now the AAA rated and the BBB rated corporate debt. So if we assume 20% risk weighting for AAA rated and 100% for BBB rated. So we'll see that capital required for AAA rating is 50 million into sovereign debt 0% into 8% plus 50 million into 20% into 8%, then 50 million into 100% into 8%. So we now observe that when we want to have 8% of things happen, we multiplied that with a factor of 0.2 for AA rated. So the requirement of the money that we should have has gone down, and when we saw that it is 100%, that means we have to go for 80% naked. So an important charge to Basel II is that previous distribution between OECD and non-OECD sovereign debt. Previously OECD sovereign debt were assigned a risk weighting of 0%. So under Basel II, credit rating of debt is determined by case to case basis. So this was the money that we should have. So that was the capital requirement, and we calculated it for both of them. Now let's move to IRB approach, which has the potential to reduce the capital requirement for bank because of their own estimates of risk, which may be lower than the cookie ratio philosophy. Now some benefits of switching from standard may be delayed because the capital requirement under IRB cannot be less than 90% of capital requirement by the previous year or 80% of the last 2 years. Now risk weighted assets is calculated as exposure at default, and capital requirement K is calculated as capital requirement into 12.5 into exposure at default. If we looked at the risk weighted assets, we remembered that we multiplied it to 12.5%. Here we are adding another thing, which is exposure at default. Note that collation is not deduced from EAD under IRB approach. Sorry, collateral is not deducted from EAD under IRB approach, but is deducted under standardized approach. For calculating the capital requirement itself, which is a function of loss given default, probability of default, and maturity adjustment, because everything here uh, would be based on them. So everything would be based on exposure at default. So the exact formula, so the exact capital requirement, which was the first term, would be LGD, loss given default, into probability of default, into a function of maturity adjustment. Now we have discussed that the basis for each input in capital requirement is described. Now the difference between foundation and advanced IRB uh, is that these loss given estimates, PD estimates, maturity estimates, everything has to be calculated. In advanced, we need to calculate everything. So loss given default is an important factor because it is linearly related to K, and K was the capital requirement. As the LGD increase, K will increase by the same percent. Under the foundation IRB approach, LGD increases with riskiness of the claim. Therefore, senior recovery rates will be higher than subordinate. Collateral can be used to reduce LGD and hence capital charge. Under the bank's IRB approach, banks generate internal estimate of LGD. So in advanced, bank generate internal, whereas in the standard, banks generate external. The probability of default calculator explicitly incorporates the correlation of specific asset. The resulting stress probability is of concave function, diminishing effect PD on K. Assets based on systematic factors and idiosyncratic factors. While the derivation is complex and based on distribution, the Basel computation based on worst case systematic at 99.9%, approximately 3 standard deviation from the mean. The maturity adjustment affects difference between foundation and advanced IRB. The foundation effective maturity is assumed to be 2.5, while effective maturity is calculated individually on PD under the advanced. Under the latter approach, maturity adjustment can have the previous effect of charging higher quality loans more than lower quality ones, as the maturity can mitigate the gains. I would like to talk about two equations here that is often seen in the IRB approach. Now you remember the risk weighted assets, and it was capital requirement into 12.5, because capital requirement is 8% and of the risk weighted assets. So the required capital should be 1 upon 12.5 into risk weighted assets. So we change that equation and risk weighted asset become capital required into 12.5, but we added another exposure at default. Now this capital requirement is again a function of loss given default into probability of default into FB. So this capital requirement itself become something tricky, and that is used to calculate risk weighted assets, or how much asset do you need. So once you look for the capital required, your capital should be calculated in the same way. Now let's compare standardized and IRB approach for credit risk. So collateral deduced from EAD, standard yes, foundation no, IRB no. Loss given estimate, standard no, foundation predetermined, decrease with seniority, IRB internal estimate. Probability of default estimate, standardized, external rating, foundations, concave PD function, advanced IRB, concave PD function. Maturity adjustment, standardized no, foundation IRB effective maturity 2.5 year, advanced adjustment for effective maturity based on PD. So that was the part here. I'll move to the type of instruments that Basel II will be applied, and types of capital. Now there are three types of capital to cover bank's risk, which is credit, operational and market risk, and they are classified into three tiers. Now the Basel III Accord retains the requirement bank at least 8% of total risk weighted assets. Now tier 3 capital is more core capital, is comprised of shareholder equity, disclosed reserve, retained earning. Equity include common stock as well as outstanding preferred stock that is not renewable and non-cumulative. Tier 2 is a supplementary capital and is comprised of other two. that may be available, but involve a mandatory charge against future income or lifetime. Tier 2 capital includes items such as undisclosed reserve, revaluation reserve, general provision. Obviously, these could be used to offset, so they are not as certain as tier 1. Tier 3 is short-term subordinate debt, then can be used to meet capital requirement. To quantify tier 3, short-term subordinate debt must be unsecured, not in arrears, and must be issued with a maturity of 2 years. The debt must be also covenant limiting interest payments to investors. Such payment would impact by variable. There are no limitation of tier 1, but tier 2 is 100% of tier 1, and according to Basel II, tier 2 and tier 3 could not be greater than tier 1, but leaves the decision up to the home country. So this is a probable area of numerical that you can see here. Okay, now the foundation approach, and I am currently in the credit risk capital management, and we are looking at 3 issues relating IRB framework. Risk components, which are riskier parameter estimates, are either developed or taken from supervisory estimate. Risk weight function, which takes risk component and translate them into risk weighted assets. And minimum requirement, which are the standard that must be made before bank is eligible to make IRB. Now, foundation approach is an IRB where heavy reliance is on supervisory estimates. The only parameter that is estimated by the bank is probability of default. The advanced method, however, allows bank to estimate also loss given default, exposure at default, effective maturity. But under either approach, the bank must use risk weight to derive capital requirement. So, as mentioned, under the foundation IRB, bank's estimate of probability of default PD and the IRB risk weighting function in turn depend on these default estimates. For example, when considering corporate loans, the foundation IRB produces a risk weight which is like probability of default 0.03, and the risk weight should be 14.44. If it's 20%, then risk weight should be 238.23. It is unlikely that you will be tested here, but we should understand the correlation about default probability and risk weight. So, as the probability increases, the risk weight increases. As the standardized approach, regardless of IRBOs, the capital charge is calculating by multiplying risk weight by exposure at default and then multiplying by 8%. So, the whole thing would increase because we'll add the risk base. Okay, so that was it. And another tricky thing here is the IRB risk weighting function. The IRB risk weighting function is used to access and determine capital adequacy, and there is a list that contains the necessary condition for IRB credit risk function. The capital requirement is measured using this. Conditions for IRB risk weighting function: expected loss are covered by provisions or revenue. Unexpected loss will be covered by bank capital. Unexpected loss will exceed capital at a small predetermined acceptable probability. Risk weight function should be portfolio invariant, that the calculation of loan is independent of the portfolio. Any correlation with any other asset of the portfolio is not explicitly included in risk estimation. This simplifies the calculation of capital loan, since a loan is independent of the portfolio that is it is added to. Difficulties including diversification and assumption are offset by calibrating the risk weighting function. Now, the capital requirement for a credit risk under the IRB approach is calculated by a model which is known as asymptotic risk factor model, and it says that capital requirement K is conditional EL minus EL into maturity adjustment, when there is a long formula which is downturn loss given default into N into a lot of other parameters. So, let's look at them one by one. First is conditional EL minus EL. Conditional expected loss and UL, the difference between expected loss, conditional expected loss and expected loss results in necessary capital. Then we have conditional expected losses, downturn loss given default into conditional probability of default, and so on. And then we have finally the maturity adjustment. So we are all looking again at the capital requirement K function, which we just talked about. So capital required, which was then multiplied into 12.5 into exposure at default, if you remember the last point. Okay, we now move to the back testing of war for market risk capital requirement. Now, internal model approach. IMA approach allows a bank to use its own risk management to determine market risk charge. The market risk charge is set in two ways. It is higher of previous day war or average war over the last 16 days adjusted by a multiplicative factor subjective to a floor of 3. The war is continually underestimated. If the war is continually underestimated, pen factor plus a plus factor is added to multiply. The multiplicative factors that include penalty are discussed in the coming part in this audio. So the previous day war and the average war over the last 60 days by a multiplying factor with a floor of 3. Now you should understand that if our previous day is higher, uh, then we can still get away if with our exceptions. If we take a look at the exceptions and understand this backtesting thing. So the bank must backtest daily results where daily changes exposure is compared to previous war estimate. Now, if the day's change in value exceeds the war estimate of the previous day, an exception has occurred. So, if you calculated war and your day's value at risk is greater than that, which means that uh, you have made an exception. Now, for 1 year, there would be 250 days that are tested. The result of backtest that we are talking about are evaluated and cumulative total exception for 250 days period. Based on the number of exceptions, the bank exposure categorized into 3 zones and scaled up by an appropriate multiple. If there are 0 to 4 exceptions, we are green zone. Then we don't do anything. If the exceptions sit between 5 to 9, then we have multiplier which starts from 0.4, and for 9 we have 0.85. Red zone is greater than or equal to 10 exceptions multiplied by a factor of 1. So these plus factors are added to a multiplicative floor of 3 and the IMA approach. So if the war is exceeded 10 or more times, the multiplicative war amount would be 4, that is 3 plus 1. If the banks consistently generate a high number of exceptions, the bank must revisit the model and adjust it is needed. So if we look at a 90% confidence interval, we'll have 25 days. So 25 days our war could exceed. There are some numericals on this which we'll again look at. Let's look at some of the questions that could come into here. So supervisory process of pillar 2 should include verify compliance and 1 and 2. The evolutionary aspect behind pillar 1 of the new accord relates to moving from and standardized approach to IRB to advanced IRB approach. So the committee envisioned that more sophisticated risk measure will be allowed to bank from calculating standard approach to using IRB foundations to advanced IRB. So that was an evolutionary aspect behind pillar 1 of new accord. Now Basel II requires backtesting framework, and it has got 3 zones, green, yellow and red. A plus factor determined of 3 zones is added to a multiplying floor of 3, and we'll look at them. Now tier 2 capital assets are available for protection depositors but involves a charge against the future as a limited life. Cumulative preferred stock involved a charge against future income, and loss reserves has a limited life. So both would be included in tier 2 capital. Credit risk mitigation techniques can either be simple or comprehensive. Under simple approach, the risk weighting of collateral is in lieu of borrower risk weight for secure portion of the exposure. Under comprehensive approach, the value of collateral is adjusted periodically and the value is deducted from the exposure. So that was it regarding the convergence of capital measurement and capital standard. I hope this added something to the current knowledge base, and thank you for listening.